the local fields of the component like this. And again, we're going to have the screen necessary fields. So let's grab them from the right side component like this, and let's bring them to the user info component. And again, in the engine init, let's also get the screen size. So set the screen size. So let's continue with the outputs. We're going to have two outputs. So of course, let's import the output from the Angular core like this. So we're going to have the user info provided output that is going to contain all the user information. So it's going to be event emitter, but not of type any, but of type of the interface that we already defined, the user information interface. So like this. Second, we're going to have an output that if the user selected the navigation to sign in, will navigate sign in. This is simply going to be an event emitter of type boolean. So these are the outputs of this component. And now let's navigate and let's continue with the local fields. So we're going to have a form, of course. So create user form of type form group like this. And we're going to have a public ISO code that we're going to use for the sk-tel-input in order to provide the initial countries and the preferred selected countries. So the ISO code is simply the ISO code from sk-tel-input. Don't worry about this, we're going to see with all detail in a moment. So these are the necessary outputs and private variables of the component. So now let's define all the dependency injection that we are going to use. So public helper right here is going to be of type help, not host listener, helper service like this. We're going to have a private form builder in order to build our form. So form builder right here. So these are completed, and now on engine init method, let's continue and set up the user information form. So set up the user information form. I'm going to have right here user information form. So this create user form is going to be this.form builder.group like this, and let's define our controls. These controls right here, we're going to paste them and of course explain each one. So let's quickly import the form control, of course, and the validators like this. So as you can see, we have the profile image, the full name, the email, mobile and mobile prefix controls. All of them are required in order to register the user. And as you can see, the email also has this pattern right here in order to have a proper form email. So this pattern is going to have to validate it in order to email to be valid and correct. Lastly, the profile image will be initiated to the value null and all the others to empty string. And of course, the mobile prefix is going to have the initial value of +30 for the Greek and for the Greek language and country. So right here we have the clean user form and contents like this. We're going to have reset the contents and set up the initial image. This dot create user form and get the control of profile image and set the value to null, the profile image. And of course, let's also erase the contents of each and every other control. So let's copy this 4 times like this, and let's grab the proper control names. So full name, email, mobile, and mobile prefix. So the value is going to be the empty string like this. And lastly, the +30 for the mobile prefix. This is right here. And now let's continue to some other useful methods. Let's paste them again and let's explain them. So we're going to have a method that's going to retrieve the user form and specifically the value from the user form. So this method accomplishes that goal. So given the control tag, this method is going to return the value of the of this control that we provided. This method right here is used in order to set the control value, the received input contents. So the content of an input, and as we're going to see, we're going to use the basic input component as we already have seen. So given the contents and the tag of the control of the form, we can simply set the value of the appropriate control, like this, with a switch case for each case. This method right here is used if the enter key is pressed in the input. So as you can see, we have no functionality, and I can leave you to this to handle it as you like in your project. And now we can continue and set up some other methods. One for the navigation to sign in. So navigate to sign in. So this method emits the event to navigate to the sign-in page. So simply this.navigate sign in like this emit the value true, because we want to navigate to the sign-in page. Now after this, we're going to define a method that is going to be triggered when the user types something in the sk-tel-input library. So this method is going to receive an event of type sk, let's name it of course sk-tel-output, like this, and it's going to be of type sk-input-output. So like this. This is an interface, and let's see what type of contents that we are going to receive. So we're going to receive a selected country code of type country code select option and the tel input contents. So let's see what it is, the select country code. It is simply right here. So the ID, the dial code, the ISO2 code of the selected country, name, SRC icon, and if it is selected and preferred. This is the method that's going to be triggered on every change on the selected, on the sk-tel-input. So first of all, let's console log the contents. So console handler sk-tel-input output like this, and we're going to have the sk-tel output. And now let's set up the form, proper form setup. We're going to place the contents. So this.create user form get the control. So it's going to be the mobile prefix first. And we're going to set the value. We're going to have the sk-tel output, the selected country code, and then the dial code. Now lastly, for the mobile phone contents, again the user form, get the proper control like this, so the mobile, and then set value, and then simply it's going to be the sk-tel-input, tel-output like this, sk-tel-output like this, and then simply the tel-input contents field. So this is a proper setup for the sk-tel-input output contents. The next method that we're going to cover is the handle selected image. This method is triggered when the user selects a user image, and this method is going to set the selected image as the profile image. As an input is going to receive a selected image but of type profile image interface. So let's define this interface inside here. So profile image like this. And now of course let's define this interface. So export interface profile image, and we're gonna have these fields. So a data given, which is gonna have the base 64 data of the selected image, data as a file, gonna be a type of file for the selected file of the image, and the type of the image. So simply, so this is the profile image interface. So let's continue with the data as a file. We have a typo, data as a file like this, and let's continue to the user info. And now let's import the interface, and so of course let's type a useful command. So this method right here, and here simply we place the information into the form. So set the selected image to the form of profile. So this created user form that get the proper control, and then set value the selected image as we have on the argument of this method. Let's continue now to the method that handles the validation and enables the register button. So check if disabled button, like this. It's gonna return a boolean type of variable, no arguments of course, and this method checks. So let's see how we can define this method. So if everything is okay, all these controls are okay, we simply want to return a false value. That means that the button should not be disabled, so it must be enabled. So return false if all controls are okay. So let's simply say all controls okay. Now let's define these controls. This is different from this .helper.check necessary cases. The value from the form, so get like this the full name and the value of this, and of course place the .trim method in order to trim the empty spaces on the front and the left and the right side of the value. So .trim. So if this control is validated, then return true because the button should be disabled. Now let's continue to the next two methods. So here we have the email, and lastly we have the mobile phone number. So for the email, we're gonna have the email control, and for the mobile phone number, we simply want to check the mobile control. Concludes the check if disabled button, in which we validate the register button in order to be enabled or disabled. We're going to define another one method. So this is a method that is triggered when the user clicks the register button. So emit provided data. So what we're going to have here? So first of all, we need to create the user information object. So create the user information object like this. So const user information provided of type user information is gonna be like this. We have the profile image, we have the full name, we have the email, the mobile prefix, and lastly the mobile. Let's grab the user form. So create user form dot get the mobile of the form and specifically the value, and of course trim in order to trim the spaces. So let's grab this method, this command right here, and place it on everyone, and let's simply change the controls and do some necessary changes. So here we have the profile image like this, and we do not need the .trim method on this. Here we have the full name and we need the .trim method. Here we have the email, in which again we need the trim method. And lastly, this is a mobile prefix, and we do not need in this case the .trim method. Now this is the object of type user information, and it is ready. We emit the data. So this user information provided emit the user information provided object that we already created, and lastly the only thing we need to do is erase all the contents of the form. So erase all the contents of the form like this. So this clean user form and contents, and with this all the functionality of this component, at least for the user info component.typescript file, is completed. Now let's continue and set up the CSS for this file and of course the HTML. Now let's see the CSS for the user info component. So let's paste it right here and let's of course explain it. So first of all, we have the user info grid with the border radius as we have seen, the white color and the margin top. Then we have the data section row, the title row, the padding row button, and of course the register button with the label. Now don't worry, all of these are going to be in the description of this episode and on the GitHub of course. So let's continue. This is the CSS for the user info, and let's continue to the HTML template of the user info component. So first of all, let's erase this, we don't need those, and let's place, of course, a useful comment. So the user info total grid, and let's continue. So we have the Ion grid. Of course, the Ion grid is gonna have a class of user info grid like this, and then we have our form, so the form. Now, of course, we're gonna have to set up the form group, and it's gonna be the create user form as we already defined. First of all, right here, we have, as we seen from the design, we have the user profile image, which we are going to create in a moment. But first of all, let's continue and create the full name and the email inputs. So right here, we have an Ion row with the class of data section row, and we have a column, and here we have the basic input. And at this moment, we need to create and define the basic input component. So let's navigate to the base input component and let's begin defining the TypeScript file. So first of all, we need to place all the inputs for this component. So let's place the inputs. So these are the inputs for the component. Let's explain them. Of course, we need the title of this input, a placeholder for the input, any initial contents, which most of the cases are going to be just an empty string, a control that states that if the basic input is a required input, an email input, so a control by the name of is email input, a read-only input, in which is defined initially as a false, and of course a control input or present title that's gonna present the title above the input or not. As an initial value we have 3. So let's continue. We are going to have, of course, outputs, the contents of the input, and if the enter button was pressed. So we have the output right here, and of course event emitters, so the contents, and then the emit enter pressed event, so if the button enter was pressed.